One of the areas of the online space that I find myself constantly engaging in are the conversations between atheist YouTubers and fundamentalist Christians. Now, of course, I have lots of disagreements with atheists. I have lots of disagreements with fundamentalist Christians. But to see the two of them go after each other, I have to admit there's a little bit of a guilty pleasure in that. And one of the most common conversations that we find is the historicity of the events of the New Testament, particularly when it comes to the life of Jesus, especially his resurrection. And so, in a June 2020 conversation with Capturing Christianity, Dr. Gary Habermas, who is a renowned resurrection theologian and historian, he was in a Q&A and he was asked this question about another YouTuber, a atheist YouTuber named Paulogia. And this is the question he was asked.
So here's a question from Janard. He says, can you ask what Dr. Gary Habermas thinks about Paulogia's theory?
Now, I won't assume that you are as engaged in the online space as I am, and I don't really want to take any words out of Paulogia's mouth. So I'm going to offer an opportunity for him to, in his own words, give the overview of his position on this.
My observation is that there is no compelling historical data that requires more than Peter and Paul to have had an experience of risen Jesus. Again, Peter and Paul alone are sufficient to explain all the relevant historical facts.
In his response, Dr. Habermas offers several points of contention, and he most prominently brings up that it is commonly held that 1 Corinthians 15 is a time when Paul is most likely citing a creed that could have been as early in Jerusalem as a few months after the resurrection of Christ. Dr. Habermas then points out that this position isn't a new one, that Paul isn't coming up with something that is cutting edge or something that is never been thought of before. And it's appeared in several different versions in the work of several theologians. He then suggests that it's fallen out of popularity within the larger historical and theological discussion, to which Paul responds that the core principles being applied are still very much part of modern theological discourse.
He's nowhere near new on that. If he wants to see the word of somebody who's been doing this for his whole life, maybe he gets it from other people, but that view has been held by Don Cupid. It has been held by the early Schillebeeckx, the Danish philosopher. It's held by Billy Markson, the Bultmannian New Testament scholar. It's held by John Shelby Spong. Versions of that. The theory's not popular anymore. And the theory's not popular because it's been blown out of the water by critics.
Among the most important New Testament scholars of the 20th century was Rudolf Bultmann, whom we've mentioned already, and whose work influenced the men Gary listed earlier. Now, among Bultmann's big ideas were existentialist philosophical interpretations of the Christian narrative and a theological approach called demythologizing, the removal or reinterpretation of the mythological elements of a text like the Bible. And sure, the conclusions that Bultmann reached about the nature of God after he demythologized are no longer in fashion. Allowing Gary to be correct on a technicality, the relevant principle of demythologizing the Bible remains in play for scholars like John Dominic Crossan and the Jesus Seminar, James D.G. Gunn, A.J.M. Wedderburn, James Keller, Chester O'Gorman, frankly, the entire progressive Christianity movement, which is surging in influence, and even the likes of Bart Ehrman and Dale Allison, whom Gary will cite.
Well, this video is less interested in addressing the conversation of the historicity of the tomb and the resurrection of Jesus. It does set the stage for the question that we're going to be exploring in this video. Who is Rudolf Bultmann? What is his theological approach demythologizing? And that is being connected to both an atheist YouTuber and the entire progressive movement of Christianity, something I consider myself to be part of. Who is this guy? Well, Rudolf Bultmann was a German theologian in the early 20th century, and most of his work was accomplished between 1910, when he wrote his dissertation, and in the 1960s, when his health became a limiting factor to his participation in the wider discourse. This picture of Rudolf Bultmann is from 1912 while he was a tutor at the University of Marburg. As you can see in this picture, he is not only a brilliant theologian, but he is also the chillest man in Germany. First and foremost, Bultmann is a form critic of the New Testament. It was during the turn of the century where theologians began arguing that the books of the Gospels were not necessarily historical documents in the strictest sense, but instead were stories and sayings and teachings about the life of Jesus, which were put into a collection to communicate theological truths held by the communities of the writers. Bultmann would apply these same principles and ideas of form criticism in his own commentary on the Gospel of John. In it, he's going to argue that there is a miracle source that John is using, along with potentially Mark as a gospel source. Back to our YouTuber Paulogia, he also shows a great interest in what amounts to skeptical form criticism. He offers an explanation on how Christianity probably started. And here's how he describes the evolution of the gospel narratives.
Stories about Jesus began to spread, not primarily by Peter, but rather through the person-to-person evangelism of the day. Neighbors talking to neighbors, merchants talking to customers. These conversations were meant to recruit new followers, not relay an accurate oral history. So in the telling, details were expanded upon, embellished, or even invented each time they were recounted. After several decades, a variety of Greek-speaking people who never met Jesus, or even Peter, took it upon themselves to begin writing down some of the stories that had circulated about Jesus and the sayings attributed to him. These written fragments were later compiled into what we now call Gospels, including some links to Old Testament themes, some explanations about how the guy people knew from Nazareth could also be from Bethlehem, and activities they imagined post-resurrection Jesus did. A great many Gospels were written. Each author who compiled a new version expanded upon Jesus' power and his divinity, going from a preacher who did miracles only under very low profile, to the co-creator of the universe who performed publicly at the drop of a hat, to someone who killed and resurrected people out of spite, to a powerful resurrected military man with an anthropomorphic giant talking cross as his sidekick.
Notably, while Bultmann and Paulogia largely agree on the processes that went into the writing of the gospel narratives, they arrive at vastly different conclusions to what that means within someone's life. Paulogia, finding out that the Bible is going through these processes of redaction and organization to communicate theological truths, becomes an atheist, while Bultmann becomes a lifelong devoted Christian. How is it that such an agreement can be made and arriving at such different implications of that fact? As Bultmann's career continued, he began to develop a theological approach that he called demythologizing. In the New Testament scripture, Bultmann argued, it is a product of a culture that is inherently mythical. It is not desirable or even possible for us to expect that men and women will adopt this mythological worldview. Famously, he's quoted as saying, we cannot use electric lights and radios, and in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means, and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder of the New Testament. Effectively, what he's arguing is that our perspectives, our foreknowledge, is shaped by the scientific world that we live in. This is a scientifically informed worldview that people living during the New Testament's writing could not understand. And so consequently, we cannot understand the worldviews with which they're coming to either. Essentially, what he argues is that it's impossible for us to ignore what we know and pretend that we hold the mythical world of the New Testament. We don't believe that demons cause illness and seizures and blindness. We don't believe that we need to call a priest when our house displays some mold. We don't believe that it is somehow sinful to eat pork. And so it would be disingenuous and impossible for us to try to pretend that we do hold those worldviews to be true. He's also not satisfied for us to simply accept that some parts of the New Testament are mythical and some parts of the New Testament aren't mythical. He's also not satisfied with us to say that some parts of the New Testament are mythical and other parts of the New Testament aren't. Either all of the myth is true, that Jesus literally called people back from the dead, that Jesus literally cast out demons, that Jesus literally died, was crucified, buried, and resurrected, or we have to admit that the whole of the New Testament is a mythical writing. Myth, for Bultmann, is a description of reality that seeks to describe a specific kind of reality. And when I say kind of reality, Bultmann clarifies that he believes that there are two kinds of reality. There's objective reality, and then there's existential reality. And myth describes existential reality in objective terms. An objective view of reality seeks to name just the facts and sees the world in a way that is analogous to a series of dominoes. When we look at history, for example, given sufficient context, we can see the ways in which one event leads to the next, and so on, and so on, and so on. Jesus speaks out against the Pharisees. The Pharisees are deeply offended and feel threatened. The Pharisees collude to have Jesus killed. Objectively, we can see how each of those series of events led to the next. An objective view, however, cannot provide insight to the meaning of the event. I'll say that one more time. An objective view of reality cannot be used to assign meaning to that event. Within the historical study of the New Testament, we do not find extra biblical sources that affirm the claims, at least all of the claims, of the Gospels. These events are not able to be accounted for within an objective view of history outside of the Bible. The only thing that we can prove with Scripture is that people believed that these events took place. But even if we could do more, even if we could prove that these were real historical events, if we were to somehow build a time machine, go back in time with our video cameras, record the miracles, record the teachings, record the crucifixion, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, this objective proof would not provide existential meaning to these events. That is to say, how we should live our lives in response to those events. It can only prove that they are objectively real, that they are objective facts. It can't provide existential meaning. Because this objective reality of events does not have any bearing on existential reality, it's worthless to try and prove their historicity for the purpose of interpreting the existential reality. That is to say, if we could go back in time and record these events exactly as they took place, if even doing that would not provide existential meaning, then it is ultimately worthless for us to try to do that with the tools that we have available to us now. And this is where demythologizing comes in. Bultmann described the role of myth as speaking of a reality that lies beyond what can be objectified, observed, and controlled, and that is of decisive significance for human existence. In effect, it takes something which is outside of the real objective reality and objectifies it. It makes something that's ununderstandable, that is outside of this world, and brings it into this world in objective, relatable facts. In effect, it removes any of the existential meaning that it might have had for the sake of bringing it into an understandable world. Demythologizing, then, seeks to find the transcendent existential reality of each text that is being objectified into myth. It's important to recognize that Rudolf Bultmann does see the importance, at least the purported importance, of the use of myth and symbols within the texts. He recognizes that they do provide a type of meaning to the text that helps people connect to them. And so it might seem logical that we would say, once we've demythologized a text and found its existential meaning, the next step would be for us to remythologize in a current context. But Rudolf Bultmann denies that that's a good idea or something for us to favorably do, because he notes that if we start remythologizing texts once we've found their existential meaning, then we just expect somebody to demythologize somewhere else. He says that that's a continual process that would have to occur over and over and over again as the world changes and new forms of natural and scientific knowledge are gained, thus enabling us to further demythologize the texts. Here, it is important that we recognize what demythologizing is not. It is explicitly not an attempt to remove layers of myth in order to find or better understand the historical Jesus. Again, that is a worthless endeavor. Finding the historical Jesus would not give us existential truth about those events. And so it is no use to do that. That would be what we would call the practice of liberal theology. And so for this reason, it surprises me that Bultmann's theology is being discussed within the context of a debate around a historical resurrection. Apologia does not recognize nor believe that there is meaning to be found in the resurrection narrative. To him, it's just a story that first century people believed and repeating. It is not objectively true, nor does it have existentially true characteristics. At least not existential truth that can't be found somewhere else. And so Apologia perpetuates this misunderstanding about what demythologizing is when he lists his Bultmann-inspired theologians. He includes within the list the Jesus Seminar, which was explicitly organized with the stated goal of reviewing each of the sayings and the deeds attributed to Jesus in the Gospels and determining which of them can be considered authentic. The Jesus Seminar is expressly oriented in finding the historicity of the events of the New Testament. That's not something that Bultmann is ultimately interested in. And for that matter, I'm not sure that I'm willing to allow that the entire progressive Christianity movement can be said to be rooted in Bultmann's demythologizing, with what the admittedly anecdotal amount of conversation I've participated in the historicity of the New Testament. If there is any concern about whether or not the events of the New Testament really happened, it is inherently not Bultmannian. Ultimately, it appears that the continued legacy of Bultmann, at least in the context of this conversation, is doomed to experience the misunderstanding that demythologizing is little more than just removing the myth, demythologizing, but completely ignoring the potential for discovering deeper existential meaning within the New Testament scriptures. This much is clear. Apologia's position is not Bultmannian. And so what is it? Because it's not a liberal theology, Apologia is not seeking to know God better. It's simply a naturalistic understanding of the events of the New Testament, not rooted in Bultmannian theology. But there is still Bultmannian theology to be found. I've personally found great meaning in the ways that Bultmann interprets Scripture, and there does seem to be a revival of sorts around Bultmann's work. Dr. David Congdon, for example, is currently utilizing Bultmann's work in his text, The God Who Saves, where he describes this problem.
The problem I'm trying to solve here is how do we understand the universal account of God's grace, while at the same time acknowledging and affirming the concrete historicity and specificity of each person, so without denying each person's uniqueness and individuality within history. So I'm attempting to reconcile those two worlds. Often you emphasize the universality and you lose the individuality, or you emphasize the individuality and the freedom, but you lose the universality. And I'm trying to find a different way to reconcile the two. And I do that primarily through a reworked version of apocalyptic theology, with some existential theology from Bultmann.
Bultmann's work continues to be a source of reflection and a powerful lens through which we can find meaning in this life, just not in the way that Apologia or Habermas seems to think that it does.